Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our State Street Forum. My name is Heather Kirk-Davidoff. I'm the minister of the Westminster Presbyterian Church in Albany, New York. And Westminster is a co-sponsor of the State Street Forum with the New York State Council of Churches, and the executive director of the council is here with us, Peter Cook. Hi, Peter.
Hi, how are you?
And also co-sponsored by the Focus Churches of Albany, and the executive director of the Focus Churches, Fred Bohr, is here with us. Hi, Fred.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank Bishop Nelson for sending up that warm Florida air. It's about 59 degrees here in Albany, so thank you.
Yeah, we're feeling like we're almost ready for Easter here rather than getting ready for Christmas, strangely. Well, welcome to all of you. Looking around the Zoom room here, I'm really excited about the conversation that we're about to have, because I know that each one of the people who's on this call right now has some actual expertise and personal experience with making a connection between the work of the church as it relates to those who are experiencing homelessness or struggling with permanent housing, and direct service and the advocacy for change or policy around those issues. The State Street Forum is a monthly gathering on Zoom here that's for the purpose of making connections between faith and public life, and helping those of us who are working in churches to make those connections and to move beyond the world of direct service only, and to make connections to policy that affects those who we encounter and serve. Our guests this afternoon we'll begin with Ted Houghton, and we'll have a faith response from Bishop Nelson. And Peter, would you like to say a few words of introduction to our speakers?
Great. It's just such a pleasure to have Ted Houghton here with us here today. He is the president of Gateway Housing, but he has been in public policy circles around housing for many years now. He's really, for the council, our go-to person in terms of giving an overview about what's happening with housing policy in our state and nationally. And we're really looking forward to his reflections today. And we also will then hear a faith reflection from Bishop R.C. Hugh Nelson, who is the senior pastor of the Church of God in East Flatbush, which initiated the development of about a 325-unit affordable housing development called Ebenezer Plaza. I believe that's just phase one, and that there's more housing to come, but he's an amazing man who will be able to offer us a spiritual reflection today. So I'd like to begin with Ted. And Ted, I wanted to begin by asking you if you could give us a little bit of an overview of some of the policy initiatives that are underway right now or being considered currently and in the next few months by the state legislature.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And I'm happy to be here. I mean, faith-based organizations are like the backbone of so much advocacy and direct services in homelessness and affordable housing. And Bishop Nelson is just the latest example of a faith-based organization taking things into their own hands and creating housing, much needed affordable housing for people in their community. And there's a long tradition of that. And it really has been something that over and over again, I've seen how faith-based organizations, when I was at the Department of Homeless Services many years ago, before that, even when I was with the Coalition for the Homeless, it was faith-based organizations that were leading the advocacy at DHS here in New York City. We had so many faith-based organizations as contractors and developers of affordable housing. And it really, the faith-based world really helps us achieve so much of what we've done. Lately, I've been doing this for 30 years, trying to end homelessness, and I'm not, we're not there yet, and that's all my fault, I guess. But it's an uphill battle. But I feel like there have been some real achievements in that. Back in the in 1955, we had 93,000 people in New York State in upstate psychiatric hospitals, in psychiatric centers. And these were terrible places, and you had no civil rights. And then they invented Thorazine and started letting everybody out. And for the vast majority of people, this was successful. They came back into the community, and they were able to get the supports from family and friends and from Medicaid, from the Mental Health Act, community mental health services. But for some, they ended up in inappropriate places, flop houses and SROs that didn't work so well. Some of them, it was a great refuge for them. But by the 1980s, as we saw cities having an influx of new residents, a lot of people got displaced. And that's when we really started seeing homelessness in the mass scale that we're seeing now. And in response to that, a number of people, Brooklyn Queens Catholic Charities, one of the most significant, the West Side Federation for Seniors Supportive Housing, which is an organization that came out of the Presbyterian Church. A number of groups created what we call today supportive housing, and that's just affordable housing, usually studio apartments for formerly homeless people with services downstairs. And those services are voluntary. If your case manager bothers you, you're a tenant, you have tenants' rights, and you can tell them to go jump in the lake. And then that caseworker has to try to figure out how to reach you better. And we have found this voluntary tenant-centered way of serving people has been very effective, because it makes us work harder to be better, and people's civil rights are respected and their tenants' rights are respected. And it really works out for the community as well. We did a study a few years ago. We had the New York University Furman Center take a look at thousands and thousands of property records. And we found that the closer you were to new supportive housing, the faster and higher your property values rose, because the supportive housing was creating more security on the block. It often replaced an empty lot or a vacant building, or a building that was not being run very well, and gave support to the people that needed it, and became a very good neighbor. That really is the long-term solution for a lot of disabled people who have become homeless. For families, the vast majority of families don't need that level of support. Unfortunately, we're seeing a higher and higher percentage of people who are employed entering into the shelter systems across the state. And that's really a terrible thing. But we're seeing like 25% of the heads of households and families who are in homeless shelters are working. And that's a failure of our housing market. And you know, how do we address that? I mean, part of it is that there's just not, the price of housing has gone up and up and up, and it takes up a much larger portion of the individual household budget than it used to. And the kinds of supports that are there for poor and very poor people just don't go far enough. One out of every five households that need it get a Section 8 rental subsidy. That means there's 4 families that are struggling to pay for housing that qualify for a Section 8 rental subsidy, but can't get it because we just don't allocate enough money to it. It is not an entitlement. It is just, it's something, it's a tool that's very effective, but there's just not enough of it. And we have not been able to get Washington to come through with it. What's happened recently in the last 10 or 15, you know, for the first 20 years that I worked at this, whenever you talked about rental assistance, people would say, yeah, you got to go down to Washington and get us more Section 8, because that's the federal government's role. In the last 10 or 12 years, 15 years, we're now seeing more locally funded rent subsidies. New York started with the Advantage program under Bloomberg. Then we went in de Blasio with Link, and now we have, now we call it City FEPS, the Family Homelessness and Eviction Prevention Supplement. And that builds off of a state rental subsidy called FEPS that is there to help people who are at risk of becoming homeless. The City FEPS helps both people at risk of being homeless and people who are already homeless. And it's become a great tool to get people to be competitive in the housing market again. And there's nothing better than housing as a stable platform for all sorts of improved outcomes, whether that's better educational attainment, better employment opportunities, familial stability, better mental health, better health in general. We see housing brings all these things, these advantages. It's really the quickest way to improve things for both families and individuals who are struggling to make ends meet. In the healthcare realm, we often say if housing was a pill, nobody would hesitate to prescribe it. It has better, you know, we have done studies, there are a number of universities have done studies of people who are HIV/AIDS population that is on Medicaid is has very expensive healthcare costs. When you provide housing to them, it brings down those costs because people stop using the emergency room. They get a primary care doctor. They get onto the medications they need to. And it really lowers the overall Medicaid spend, as they say, much more so than just about any other medical procedure. I mean, it's more cost effective than anything but angioplasty. And if it was a medical thing, we would never say, well, you know, what's the return on investment here? But because it's housing, we're always asking, well, how much money does it save in the other systems? And that's a compelling case, you know, that if the average homeless person is costing you $50,000 a year just to keep homeless because they're using shelters, they're using emergency rooms, and they're getting involved in criminal justice system, all those things. When you place that person into supportive housing, it reduces the cost by more than half. And that pays for almost the entire cost of building, operating, and providing services in that supportive housing. My $50,000 figure is way out of date at this point, but the studies that we started with back in 2000 have now been done over and over again for progressively more disabled populations. And you can see savings among the very high cost Medicaid users by placing them into supportive housing that run in the $100,000 per tenant. It's really quite amazing. So we need to address homelessness in a few different ways. Certainly there's the emergency crisis response with shelter and street outreach and all those things, but also we need to provide people the rent subsidies that they need in order to become competitive in the housing market. And then we also need to create more housing because there's just not enough housing out there. New York City, there's a real consensus here about getting more people rent subsidies because we've seen how stable housing has helped in so many other ways. But even if we gave everybody a rental voucher, there's just not enough apartments to rent. Upstate, it's not as tight a market, and it gets more into housing quality issues. The housing is out there. I had the opportunity many years ago to assist the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee, with their homeless problem, and they were able to reduce homelessness by reduced chronic homelessness by 89% and overall homelessness by 50% because they had a 13% vacancy rate in their housing market. And it really was about getting rental vouchers to the people who needed them most, to go to a housing first approach where you get people into housing where they can become stable and then try to fix them rather than keeping them in shelter until they're so-called housing ready. And by shifting that approach, by providing more rental assistance, by creating supportive housing for people who needed some supportive services, Chattanooga, which resembles Albany more than most cities, was able to really get a handle on their homeless problem. In New York City and some other places, it's not quite so easy because we have we've added 1.5 million people in the last 20 years, and we haven't built nearly enough housing for them all. And the fact is that people's wages have not kept up with the cost of housing. And so those rental subsidies, those supports really need to be expanded. We hope to see some continued improvement by having these rental subsidies available, but we're also going to have to create housing. And, under Mayor de Blasio and under Governor Cuomo, and now hopefully with Governor Hochul's new 5-year affordable housing plan, we've seen a renewed commitment at the city and the state level to do a lot, to create a lot more very low income housing. And you're seeing more affordable housing being built at deeper affordability levels, and that's a very good thing. One challenge upstate is that the cities of Buffalo and Rochester and Syracuse and Albany are just not, they're not in as good fiscal shape as New York City. And so they can't contribute as much capital to leverage state resources as the city is able to. And so a lot of times you really have to do it with just state resources. Those state resources can go a long way, and the state creates a lot of housing. I mean, something close to creating and preserving about 20,000 units or I guess that might be overstating, maybe 15,000 units statewide each year. But a lot of those are preserving occupied units as affordable, so you're not creating as many as you need to. But we are making progress. I just don't know if we're going to get to the scale of housing development that we need to. And this is a nationwide problem with the United States housing market, because it's so difficult to build housing now because of local zoning rules, building codes, all these things, which are good things and good protections that are useful, but we still haven't been able to crack the nut where we're able to build as much housing. And part of that is that we're not Phoenix, Arizona. We can't just, have a surveyor go out and do another couple miles of deserts and put a bunch of houses there. It's we're aging cities are notoriously difficult to build in, especially when they're as compact as some of the cities in New York State are. But it is achievable. And so there's a lot of programs out there. This year, there is a real push among advocates to get more rent subsidies from the state. There is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which ERAP, which is part of the federal COVID response that provides payments to pay off back rent arrears. That's a significant program, like $2.7 billion statewide, that that had a rough rollout, but it had a rough initial rollout, but then they got it going, and Governor Hochul has really turned it around, and now New York State has become one of the states that has been most skilled at getting the money out on the street to the people who need it most. That's a good thing. Unfortunately, we're out of money now, and the state the eviction moratorium expires on January 15th, and you know that the people who are facing the most challenges probably didn't apply for this money early on and are going to come knocking at the door and find out that the cupboard is bare. And so this is a real concern among advocates. The state needs to either get more money from Washington or contribute state dollars to the pot itself, probably both, in order to meet the need for, and that's just for rental arrears, not moving forward. Moving forward, there is a very good bill in Albany right now, the Housing Access Voucher Program, which is essentially HAVP, which is essentially a state Section 8 rent subsidy. It's pegged to the Section 8 fair market rent levels, and it would assist, I think, 50,000 households in its first year. Once government gets into the business of rent subsidies, it's got to stay in that business. You can't, if people are depending on rent subsidies to stay housed, you can't take them away. One time that did happen under Bloomberg and Cuomo, where the state said we're not going to contribute to the Advantage rental voucher, and Bloomberg said, well, we're not going to do it if you're not going to do it. And then 16,000 people and families using that voucher were evicted and returned to the shelter. And that was a disaster. It has driven much of the increase in family homelessness that we saw about starting a few years ago. Since the pandemic, family homelessness has gone down. I think that, we're not exactly certain of the dynamics, but that's the case. But we are worried that it will return to historic levels after the eviction moratorium ends. And that's a real big concern. So
Ted, maybe we could just put a bookend on that right now. And you've given us a lot to talk about, from housing, the creation of supported housing, the redevelopment of housing, the HVAP program, and the eviction moratorium, the expiration of the eviction moratorium coming up. All of these things we need to talk about a little bit more, but I do want to give Bishop Nelson just a couple minutes to give his 2 cents, and then we're going to open it up and let's queue up some questions, everyone, and let's get the conversation started. Bishop Nelson, would you like to take just a few minutes to tell us about how your congregation is responding right now?
Thank you so very much.
Can you go ahead and unmute yourself? Oh, there we go.
All right. My apologies for the fact this is a little awkward for us engaging, but when Peter Cook asked if I would participate, number one, I'm excited about the work that all of you are doing. And secondly, I've just had the privilege of meeting Reverend Cook and getting to know more in terms of the kind of work that this coalition does. But our local congregation, about 11 years ago, we were actually looking at expanding our sanctuary. Our initial concern was that we needed larger space for our sanctuary. And so everything we saw that could accommodate our ministry was outside of our ability. And so after several doors were closed, as we prayed for direction, we felt that if God indeed has a next step, then surely he has the resources. And so by faith, we took this step and purchased 2 city blocks, again, with the initial idea of building a larger sanctuary space and with parking. But over time, we felt, no, if we were going to invest this amount of money, it had to be more than just for the sanctuary. It had to be more than just for the church having a larger footprint. It had to be, how do we raise the value or the welfare of our community? And so timing is also great, because at the same time, Mayor de Blasio was campaigning for the office of mayor and made a commitment to address the issue of homelessness and affordable housing. So after we purchased, we went through the process of rezoning the 2 properties, and ultimately, as our friend Peter Cook described earlier, we have just completed phase 1, which is the church space on the ground floor of about 40,000 square footage and 350 apartments, of completely affordable. God's willing, next year we will build on the other block. But at least what we're grateful for is that God has given us the grace not only to speak to the spiritual welfare of our community, but to become engaged in the practical existential needs of our neighbors. And so, as we're reminded in Matthew chapter 25, which is the picture in my mind of the final judgment, and that's where the scripture says, and of course, God made the separation between the sheep and the goat, and he used an interesting way of evaluating them. He says, when I was naked, so he placed one group on the right, one group on the left, and he says to those he considered righteous, when I was naked, you clothed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. When I was a stranger, you took me in. When I was in prison, you visited me. This had nothing to do with church, the typical church gathering. This has everything to do with how we see and respond to the needs of those around us. And then the interesting thing was both groups asked the same question. Those on the left who were placed into or given off to this judgment, they asked one question: when did we see you naked? Or when did we see you thirsty? Or when did we see you as a stranger or in prison? And interestingly enough, the group considered the righteous asked the same question. They said, when did we see you naked or thirsty or as a stranger or as one in prison? And the response of the Lord was this. He says, as you have done to the least of these, you have done it unto me. What I gather from that is that those who were pushed to the left, if they had recognized that, if they had seen the face of Jesus in that person who was naked, or the person who was thirsty or in prison or homeless, if they had seen the face of Christ on that person, they would have responded to the need. Oftentimes, we forget that Christ is manifested among us, not in the religious garb of the church, but so often in the discarded condition of the less fortunate. And so I'm grateful at least that our congregation has been able to make a practical response to not only speaking to the issues of heaven and hell, but beyond that, helping to facilitate and to provide housing for those who are in such a vulnerable condition. And I pray that even as you have been working on this platform, and grateful for the work that Ted has been doing and the education that he has brought to the table, I am trusting the Lord that together we will continue to do God's work, not just within the confines of our sanctuaries, but in our response to the vulnerabilities of those around us. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bishop Nelson, for your powerful
pleasure.
witness. Appreciate it very much, and hope you'll be able to stay with us for a few minutes. And let's open up the Zoom room, and let's hear from the group for questions and comments. You can.
I just want to.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark. Sure.
I want to thank Ted and the bishop for their tremendous presentations, but even more so for their tremendous work. Had the privilege of meeting the bishop last year when we organized a workshop, and I've known Ted for about 25 years. And each of you have spoken so powerfully about what we can do as people and as citizens and as a city to make a difference in the lives of people who are struggling. So I think it's been a tremendously powerful presentation. And just to echo what the bishop said, there are clearly many people of faith who are very concerned and many working very hard on behalf of those most vulnerable. But it's so important that we share the knowledge that Ted shared with us about how we can take our spiritual values and have our society reflect those values, how we can impact on legislation and budgets so that that what God is telling us we need to do for each other, we can do in our government reflecting our values. So I just want to say thank you to both of you for your great work. And I know we'll do a lot of good work together going forward. And particularly, as Ted was saying, with the new governor, with the new mayor, and with the new engaged federal government, I think it's important to note that we have an opportunity in 2022 that we have not had for many, many years. And I just hope that we seize this opportunity and really make our values real in our society.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mark. And I want to say, Bishop Nelson didn't talk much about it, but I mean, the original motivation was trying to make sure that the congregation had a sanctuary and that it was in good repair and met their needs. And he could have very easily, used his congregation's land to make the maximum profit and everything like that. And instead, he used it as an opportunity to stabilize the church's finances and to help the community with new affordable housing. And it's great that he could do both, but that's not easy. It's not the easy way out. And so I want to give him full credit for showing that kind of leadership, because that is often the challenge for congregations, is how are they going to keep their sanctuary and keep their house of worship. And often it's difficult to do much more. And here he did much, much more. And so I want to recognize that.
Let me turn it over to Molly Dowell-Baum, who has a question.
Hey, yeah, I appreciate the link of our faith to the legislation, and I guess I'm even more excited about the idea of before we is that we can live into this even before, as we could possibly as faith communities live into it, like the bishop and your community is doing before, like, and not wait for the legislation to do it. That like we have resources of our own in our land, in our wealth, and I feel excited, and I'm interested in like having conversations with our presbytery. There's a lot of churches that are dissolving, that they don't have as much and many members to continue to have a meaningful ministry and a sustainable ministry, but there's often resources there. And I'm just wondering, as we step into what is the future of the church, for me, sort of these projects of survival that we do together as a community and not leaving anybody behind, but seeing my sister who's outside and saying, like, you know, that could be my grandmother, that could be my sister, that could be my child. How do we make sure that housing is a human right? How do we go ahead and step into it now, whilst we're also advocating in policy? So I thank all the speakers again, and this is great to hear these different ideas.
Could I just quickly respond here to Molly, and then, you know, Mark Greenberg, who's the head of the Interfaith Assembly on Homelessness and Housing, and then Ted Houghton and the bishop would have some reflections. But Molly, what we have done is set up something called the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, which, by the way, can be found on a website. It's called www.iahcny.org. I'll put that in the chat, but it really lays out in very clear detail the steps that judicatories like presbyteries and individual congregations can take to do an assessment of their property and to really move the ball down the field. And so we did a joint session with the Presbytery of New York City on this. We work with the United Methodist City Society, it's another one, to really go through this platform. And we would love to do a collaborative arrangement with the Presbytery of Albany on this as well. There actually are still some funds available through the Attorney General, which might be available to help congregations do that pre-assessment.
Let me turn it to Bill Shillity, speaking of United Methodist City Society. Bill has a comment.
Well, I did. I just want to throw another concept into this, and certainly government support is important. But one of the things that we found, by the way, we were also named with the bishop in terms of the building that we've just completed in the Bronx. One of the other things that's very important, I think, is finding a socially conscious developer, so that you have somebody who has a track record of doing some type of socially responsible, affordable housing, and they have a built-in relationship, in our case in the city, with HPD. But that was very helpful to vet through a number of developers and find the ones who knew the area in the Bronx where we had a church property that we repurposed for 154 units of low-income senior housing, 57 of which are transitional, homeless, formerly justice-involved seniors, with the Fortune Society providing on-site services. So that was sort of our work, and we hope to do a couple more of those before I retire.
Other questions, comments?
Can I just make a quick shout out to Bill as well? That you have to see this project that they just did in the Bronx with Bronx Pro. And you can see some of those pictures in the gala. And I'll put a link in the chat where Bill describes this project that addresses the needs of seniors, including 25% of the units for justice-involved individuals. It's a really amazing, and then also Bishop Nelson's project as well, but I'll put that in the chat.
I want to just respond to something that Molly put in the chat about the criminal justice issue, because I think it's a good point and an important one. When we looked at the costs of keeping somebody homeless, criminal justice was one cost, but it was a really very, very small one. The percentage of homeless people that get involved with the criminal justice system in any significant way, where they actually go to prison or jail, is actually really very, very small. It's very expensive when somebody does go to jail. I mean, a year in Rikers costs $440,000 somehow. I don't understand how it could be. Prison is considerably less expensive, but still a very costly, incarceration is costly. And then it's just got, you know, terrible human consequences afterwards for people's earnings and ability to re-enter into the community. When people are placed into homeless people are placed into stable housing, there's almost no interaction with the criminal justice system. It's really about, you know, as Molly said, there's a lot of harassment for people living on the streets and this sort of constant interaction with police. And once you place somebody into their own home, that goes away. And so I think it's important to state the scale.
Tom, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I run something called the Southend Community Collaborative, which is basically a Zoom meeting these days. But one of the things that I think is not appreciated about the impact of homelessness is the impact on the people who live in a dispossessed neighborhood. Right now in the south end of Albany, the unattached homeless, the people who get no services except a bed on a cold blue night, has gotten to the point where whole neighborhoods are affected, and it affects their quality of life. It affects anybody's ability to actually improve housing or anything else there. Right now we have our local elementary school. The parents are considering how to get their kids to and from school without traumatizing them. And unfortunately, the easiest solution is bus service. It's not cleaning up the neighborhood, it's bus service. And that's because the police are ineffective and have pretty well thrown up their hands, and they have limited capacity. People are not working together on these issues and so on. So it's just one more element that makes this really difficult for neighborhoods to revive themselves and to attract new investment and new residents.
Ted, do you want to respond to that? Is there an element of that could be leveraged for advocacy?
I think so. I mean, it's the frog in the boiling pot, and that people have gotten so used to people living in public spaces, and it's unbelievable. I mean, I was in Manhattan recently, and it is worse than ever. And I think that COVID has made people even more reluctant to go into shelter. One of the silver linings is that we have seen more reliance on safe havens and settings where you're not in a large dormitory, but it's 1, 2, or 3 people to a room, which is, I think, vastly preferable to people seeking shelter. And so we're seeing more of those models, but still, we tend to rely on dormitory emergency accommodations, which are fine if they're used in an emergency. But what happens is that, now in New York City, the average length of stay is over 500 days. That's the average length of stay. So people are using shelters as housing, and that's terrible. So, trying to figure out how to engage people in street. So often I hear, oh, we're going to increase the number of outreach teams. And that's probably, I wouldn't be surprised, Tom, if that's what they're saying. Oh, we're going to have more street outreach, but it's not having more street outreach. It's giving the street outreach workers more to offer people that they want. I mean, a trip in a van to a large impersonal shelter that people don't feel safe in is not the answer. Coming up with safe haven rooms and that sort of thing is much more effective. And I think that, unfortunately, we're not seeing enough of that.
Ted, you mentioned that there's this, potentially, at least the beginning of a game changer before the New York legislature coming up in the next session, which is the HAVP program, the Housing Access Voucher Program. And that's for, as I understand it, it's like a Section 8, right? It's housing on the open market, as it were. You started your presentation by talking about supportive housing, which has such a significant impact on those who are mentally ill and who have trouble remaining housed. And I'm wondering, that's just been on my mind recently because some of our friends that we interact with through focus churches do get housing in the city of Albany. Albany's better than some cities I've lived in for actually getting people housed. But sometimes the very people who get housing have trouble staying in the housing. And I was wondering if you know anything about any state initiatives or efforts to increase funding for supportive housing.
Yeah, no, I mean, the state has been very good. The Homeless Housing Assistance Program, HHAP, is at the State Welfare Department, Office for Temporary Disability Assistance, OTDA. So I've already used two acronyms in one sentence. I apologize, but HHAP is the capital dollars for building new housing and also investing in existing supportive housing that needs to be refinanced and have, get a new roof and things like that. But HHAP is available only to nonprofits, only for supportive housing. And it was increased from $64 million a year to $128 million a year. That's huge. That's really big. I asked for it to be increased again because we keep on developing this capacity, not just in government, but among the affordable housing development community, both nonprofit developers and private developers, to build more and more affordable housing. New York State and New York City really lead the nation in that capacity. And so each time, Mayor Koch started with a 100,000 unit initiative to develop 100,000 units. Mayor Bloomberg did 165,000 unit commitment. Mayor de Blasio did 200,000 and then bumped it up to 300,000 units over 12 years. And so that kind of, we wouldn't have been able to get to that level right away. You have to build that capacity up, but we have done that. And that's true in New York State as well. So trying to do more of that. And one of the things that helps facilitate that is land. And one of the things that faith-based organizations often have is land. And, turning that parking lot into affordable housing is a very good thing for the community. And it also, you can get share in the developer's fee, where, the congregation can have some money that shores up its financing as well. It's not easy to do. It takes a certain level of expertise. It takes good partners and everything, but you can do programs where you have affordable housing and some portion of the units are reserved for homeless, now formerly homeless households. In supportive housing, you have a clear funding stream for the services, and that's great for, severely disabled people with mental illness and other kinds of disabilities, people living with HIV/AIDS and other things. What we don't have so much is other community supports that are less intensive for people who need less help. And those are some of the models that I think you're referring to that we need to develop more. I mean, the fact is that when somebody shows up to a landlord with a Section 8, some landlords are very happy to take this guaranteed funding stream for the rent, but others see that as a red letter and they don't want to rent to people with Section 8s. If you pair that Section 8 with a phone number to a nonprofit that is going to visit the person once a month or be there when that person is in crisis, all of a sudden the door is open. I mean, a lot of landlords, they just want a phone number to call if anything goes wrong, and that assurance is enough. So we could pass a law to ban source of income discrimination, basically not renting to Section 8 recipients, which would be a good thing. But I think we could also really do more to create sort of a neighborhood-based, community-based support system from nonprofits to be there to help people when there's an eviction case, to help them with entitlement advocacy when they lose their jobs, to help them with domestic violence or whatever kinds of barriers and hurdles they encounter. It's not easy to set that up, but there are some models that show that what we call service enriched housing, which is, not as intensive as supportive housing, can work for a lot of people, especially people who were once homeless.
But I'm looking at a question here from Molly, which I think is good to note. Are these developments either solely affordable or low income, or can there be mixed income projects? That's one question. Then I wanted to say, particularly in our upstate context, in Tom McFeeters, who has been working on the Southend coalition here in Albany for a long time, would understand what I'm talking about. One of the biggest problems are dilapidated buildings, which have fallen into disrepair, which will take amazing amounts of public investment just to bring them back online. And that paired with trying to increase the percentage of home ownership within a given community so that the ecosystem is more balanced. Could you talk a little bit about mixed use in terms of affordable housing and also home ownership as it relates to strengthening the affordable housing market?
I have forgotten, there are so many different kinds of affordable housing programs that I've forgotten more of them than I could talk about in this one session. But there are affordable housing development programs for extremely low income, very low income, homeless, just low income, which is defined as 60 or sometimes 80% area median income or lower. Moderate income housing, middle income housing, like the Mitchell Lama program that was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and created Co-op City and other very large rental buildings, and some condominium like co-op buildings. And then there are a lot of home ownership capital development programs. The Affordable Housing Corporation is a program at New York State Homes and Community Renewal that provides capital subsidy to developers to create multifamily buildings that are co-ops that provide home ownership opportunities for low-income people. And they provide a capital subsidy that allows the price of purchase to be low enough that people that normally wouldn't be able to afford housing are able to. There's also the State of New York Mortgage Agency, which provides subsidized mortgages or provides mortgages to people who might not have the credit or other kinds of qualifications to get mortgages on the private market. So there's a lot of different, and then there's rent, then there's a lot of tax breaks that are available to developers to provide housing to low-income people. The Affordable New York 421A program is for market rate developers to reserve a percentage of the units for affordable that are affordable to people of various income levels. And you can get basically a 20-year tax break on your property taxes in New York City for building a big luxury housing tower that reserves 20% of the units for people with very low incomes. You also have the ability of doing 25% for low income or 30% for moderate income. But there's a whole menu of possibilities. There's also all these rent subsidies. Section 8 can be project-based, which means it's not tenant-based. It's not attached to the tenant, but attached to an actual apartment. And by attaching it to a specific apartment in a specific building, that means you've got this guarantee that there will be a rental income stream coming into that building from that rent subsidy. And therefore you can go to a bank and say, I've got 40 apartments that have Section 8s, and that means I'm guaranteed to get this much a month for the next 5 years. And we all know it's going to be renewed each time. So I want to take out a 20 or 30-year loan to build these units. And the bank will lend that money knowing that the Section 8 is in place and attached to those units.
Okay, Ted, we do have a commitment to end on time, and I see 2 hands up. So let me just pass it over to Fred real quick for a question.
Please, yes.
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Bishop Nelson. Just last week we hosted a statewide truth commission with the Poor People's Campaign and Labor Religion Coalition. And one of the people who testified about housing insecurity shared that he's working at a local housing shelter in Albany, and he can't afford an apartment.
Yeah.
And he works not far from Focus Churches, housing people who are homeless. And but with the vacancy rate in Albany right now, it's very low, and as a result, the rent prices are driving up higher. Mm-hmm. And when a low-wage worker is being asked to have 2 months rent plus another month's security up front, they're just not able to afford that. And that's become a real challenge, especially in a city where there's so many abandoned buildings, where there's anywhere from 800 to 1,000 abandoned buildings for a city with fewer than 95,000 people. It's just a very high rate. And in terms of the emergency sheltering, I'm on the Code Blue committee here in the city of Albany. And I guess a couple of things that a lot of housing service providers have identified is that there isn't enough of a housing first model being implemented in Albany. And part of that is because that requires more funding for the housing itself. And it also requires more resources to train staff on having that approach and just really seeing that housing as a right. Like once you house people, regardless of whether they might be drunk or they might be high, for example, and they're going to be turned away from other places because many shelters are not low barrier shelters, but they have certain standards. And a lot of folks that Tom was describing who are homeless, they're not able to access these shelters, even if they can get into them. And then, as Ted, as you point out, if they can get into some of these shelters, they don't necessarily feel safe there, that these are places where there's violence or threats going on, or they feel are very impersonal. So it's a real challenge for us. But I think part of what we're trying to do locally in Albany is to advocate for more funding for a housing first model, to identify the intersectionality, as Ted has shared, in terms of healthcare and housing and the mutual benefits.
It's a cultural education process. I mean, when I went down to Chattanooga, they were at the mental health clinic waiting for people to keep their appointments. And if they didn't keep their appointments, they weren't their problem. And that's not the way you do it. You have to get people into housing and then figure out what they need and give it to them. And it takes some education. We had this where supportive housing providers had a 6-month clean and sober requirement before they would accept somebody into housing. I got it down to 3 months. Then I got them like, okay, yes, he's an active heroin user, but he's also got a job. Take a chance on him. They did, and they realized, hey, we can handle this. And it took a while, but it's cultural. You know, you have to learn and gain confidence. I want to give Tom a chance to ask his question since he has his hand raised before we go off here.
Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I wanted to thank Peter Cook for bringing up the Southend's planning process, and I put my contact in the chat. We decided to start with home ownership, not affordable rental housing, because the Southend has about 20% home ownership rate. And it's great to have supportive housing, but one of the things that is most supportive for low-income people is their neighbors. We need to have a strong infrastructure there as well. But the plan is available if anybody wants to contact me.
And you need to build, households need to build wealth. I mean, home ownership is the best thing to build wealth, and people of color have been kept out of the housing market forever and ever. And we need to do way more to expand home ownership for people who haven't been able to do it.
We are going to stop the conversation here, but I think it's clear to both Peter and I that we need to do another forum, and specifically on well, some of these issues, including promoting home ownership and neighborhood stability, but also on the issue of housing first, and what does housing first actually mean, and what does it require? And Ted, I think you helped us to see that there is an enormous amount of funding, but there's also these barriers, and some of the barriers to making use of that funding is, as Fred has encountered, it requires a mindset, a change of mindset, where housing
and we need more funding. I mean, there's an enormous amount, but we still need even more. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for your time. I am sure you have just a lot of other people who want to hear from you, and this has been terrific, informative, and inspiring. And thank you, Bishop Nelson, for taking time in the midst of your car trip and busman's holiday there to still be on duty as you're driving. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We will put the recording from this forum up online, and Peter has added some links to the chat. And Peter, would you be willing to also, as we post this, to add those links for more information and so on to the council's website?
Yeah. And please share my contact info, Peter. It was great to meet all of you, and I really appreciate you having me.
Great. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. And blessings on the holiday and on the new year.
Thank you, everybody. It was really a pleasure to have all of you here today.